Hi, I'm Jason Leahy, Executive Director with the Illinois Principals Association. Thank you for taking time to watch part one of our IPA talk with these teacher fellows. Here's part two. So talk to me then about this study, the report that came out. I mean, what was the process that you went through in order to get a hold of this information and make sure that this important story is told within the greater context of the teacher shortage issue in general? Because let me just make I think an important note. It's a critical statistic that is one that we can't lose sight of. And stats, sometimes feel faceless in all of it, but it's a big one. And the fact is that over 50% of our kids are minority students, and 15% of our students?
14.8.
Okay, well, thank you for being specific. of our educators or teachers are educators of color, correct? So that's a big disconnect because we know how important it is for kids to be able to have educators with them that look and have similar stories as them. I can speak to that very personally because my dad was my principal, so I had some of that. That's a whole other aspect. I'm not advocating for that, but it had a big impact on me, so we know how important this is. But just talk to me a little bit about the study and how you went about that and really work to get a hold of some of these stories. Anybody want to give that a shot?
Sure. So I think as teachers of color, we tend to gravitate towards each other, especially in buildings that don't necessarily look like us, or on that behalf, look like our students. So we actually started by doing focus groups in each of our respective communities. So I held a focus group with about 10 to 15 teachers, and then I know Corey and Keisha held their own focus groups. So this is how we created an environment that felt safe and comfortable for the teachers. They knew us, they knew that their stories were going to be well represented, and they also knew that their stories were being told in a safe place. Even though we had 15 teachers, we broke those up into smaller focus groups. So that's how we initially gathered our data. And then from that data, we all analyzed it, put it together, and then came up with our 4 findings.
So with the focus groups, what types of questions or conversations were you having as part of that? Would you be able to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, this was a year ago, but I will try. I know that it was pretty a little bit basics, like what brought you into the profession. Have you ever experienced microaggressions? What are some barriers that might have you from leaving the classroom that you're experiencing in your daily life? And we actually had some people who had already left the classroom, so we also asked, what was your reason behind leaving the classroom? What are some things keeping you in the classroom? And then, again, what are some things that are having you stay or leave the classroom?
Wishes and desires.
Yeah.
I think it's important to also point out that there were 6 of us core members of our group, but that when we did our focus groups, we expanded that so that we wanted to make sure that voices around the state were heard. We are representative of the northern portion of the state, but we recognize that there are teachers of color around the state and that their needs differ. And we wanted to make sure that those were addressed as well.
Sure.
And one thing about the questioning that actually brought us to this space today is that we asked, well, what can be done in looking at some of these issues at a school level, at a district level, at a state level. So we're able to really examine lots of these different levels, that really impact, our work, our collective work.
Sure. So I want to get into both the findings here a bit and as well as some of the recommendations you had. And I do feel like even though there are obvious differences as you look at a large state as Illinois is, but I think that the recommendations and the finding that you had, there's really a universality about each of those that I think is important, that school leaders in particular, principals, need to be paying attention to. And it was very instructive to me personally as well. So let's talk a little bit about just some of the findings. Corey, would you mind sharing just some of the findings from your perspective, maybe those that maybe resonated most with you?
Yeah, of course. And I think before we actually get into the findings and the recommendations, one of the important things to highlight is the context through which we're actually entering this conversation. there are a lot of historical, social, institutional like issues that really plague our nation, our country, our world, and the impact that has in educational spaces is something that's seen as well. Years of historic and systematic and institutional racism are things that we today have inherited, like all of us, right? And that actually is where a lot of the issues are rooted when we start looking at, why teachers of color decide to enter the workforce. What's keeping us here and what actually forces us to leave. One of the reasons why I became an educator, is because when I graduated in 2006 from high school in Philadelphia, only 46% of Black boys really were doing that. And there's a disconnect. And I had access to things within the system that truly weren't designed for my success. So that's the thing that pulled me in. And I had some really great teachers and educators along the way that set that, that the condition for me. None of whom were educators of color.
Yeah.
None of whom looked like me, none of whom shared an experience like me. And I think that these were all questions that I was truly
So let me
grappling
ask
with.
you, before we get into looking at what some of these findings and things were, I mean, what helped get you then sitting in the seat that you're in right now and being a part of this conversation right now and the position that you're in?
Yeah, well, I have to say that there were lots of spaces that I had the privilege to be a part of, right? I went to a magnet school in Philadelphia, which is something that a lot of students of color don't have access to when we talk about like what quality education like could look like. So there were things that allowed me to engage with the world in different ways. I'm also a first generation college graduate with 2 degrees. So I think the spaces that I had access to truly allowed me the opportunity to get here in this spot and to be reflective about some of the limitations that don't allow folks like me to actually stand in front of a classroom of 25 kids.
Would you think that for both of you it was similar type of experience, or was there something different?
I would say similar, but also different. So the reality is that a lot of teachers of color go into the classroom because we see ourselves in our students, right? Like I grew up in the Pilsen area, which is predominantly Mexican immigrant, or was predominantly Mexican immigrant. And my students are my cousins. They are my brothers and sisters. They are our family members. And their parents are just part of this larger network, not even network, community that helps uplift each other. So because of that, I went into the classroom, but I also was granted a lot of privileges early on. So my parents are both organizers, so I understood the power of using your voice. I also tested very well and got into a selective enrollment high school in Chicago, which was a pretty big deal for someone coming out of my neighborhood at that time. So that was the first access to privilege that I had, but it was also the first time that I really experienced microaggression and when I really experienced being the other and not necessarily fitting into my environment. And it was those 4 years in high school that really transformed my life and really pushed me to get into education, which is not something that I had seen before. But it really stemmed from my community and from experiences that I had and that I saw the kids around me also having.
Wow. Yeah. How about you, Keisha?
Well, mine's a little different. So I didn't know that I wanted to be an educator. And to be quite honest, I went to school, graduated with a degree in English out of Boston, and thought that I was going to be Oprah Winfrey. And
You're doing well.
yes.
You made it.
I'm a little far from Oprah. And
No, we all are.
Yeah,
by the way.
exactly,
We all
exactly.
are.
I hope
Yes.
Oprah's listening.
I hope she is. Yes, shout out to Oprah. And kept getting.
We'll ping her on Twitter, by the way. We'll do that. There you go. You bet.
Exactly, tag. So I thought I kept having my educators, my instructor say, "You would make a great teacher." And I thought, teachers don't make enough money. And I was born and raised in South Side of Chicago. My parents sent me to Catholic school so that I wouldn't, the perception of Chicago public school was that it wasn't safe. And so I didn't have a lot of teachers that looked like me, or that I thought that was an avenue for me. And so I went into a different world and came back around eventually through an alternative certification program and saw the need. I've always been a lifelong learner. And so my first experience in education really taught me that it was the place that I needed to be, but also always desired to be. So Oprah's the best teacher. And so I thought, hey, this is coming full circle.
From the research that you have from the focus groups, the stories that you were hearing, what are some consistent themes, consistent themes, consistent threads from teachers of color that we need to be paying attention to? What are they saying to us?
Can I start?
Sure.
The thing that stuck with me over and over again was this feeling of being valued, of being seen. A lot of times during the discussions and through subsequent research, because I don't want us to discount the fact that once we did the focus groups and aggregated the data, we then went in full steam into research to make sure that we weren't that we were concentrating on the right things.
Yeah.
And so,
and can I say more power to you? Being someone who's taken quantitative research classes, that is hard work.
It is.
Good job.
Yes, we devoted a lot of time. We were talking about it on our ride down here, that there was a lot of time put into that. But also we understood the importance that our words would have on others, and we wanted to do it right. So looking at the words of teachers and this idea of feeling valued and acknowledged in a space that, as Corey pointed out, wasn't necessarily designed to value you. And I can just personally, I said that I was a veteran middle school teacher, and I left the classroom this year, and that was part of the reason that I left the classroom. I think it's poignant that the thing that you pushed out today, if they listened, I would have stayed. Right. And that could have been my mantra. Just to be able to feel valued in a space and to feel like that my voice was more than that of a disciplinarian or more than just the equity person, but that I was a thought producer and a content person would have kept me in the classroom. And that was a reoccurrent theme in what we saw.
So what you're alluding to is, and I'm utilizing my language here from what I'm reading from the text, but like the hidden tax, right?
Yes,
that
absolutely.
Teachers of color are experiencing. So is anybody willing to kind of explain what that is and what that means?
Yeah, so kind of going back to why teachers of color go into the classroom, a lot of that is because they take their story with them. And then they also pick up the stories of their children. Just because we see ourselves and our kids just so much. So because of that, we end up picking up the invisible text, which becomes not just being a teacher, but also a disciplinarian, a translator for those of us that are bilingual or trilingual. We also become mom and dad and sister and brother all in one. And when you think about the amount of pressure that teachers are already put under, to add that invisible text on top just creates a lot of, for me personally, like concerns when it comes to my own mental health and my own well-being. So being somebody that
because
already...
educating kids is hard enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's enough going on.
Yeah, so being somebody that already has anxiety and depression, that's heightened when I'm in the classroom, hearing all these stories, and knowing that my job is to be a teacher and not necessarily to be a social worker. But you automatically pick everything up. So that's the invisible text. So that was one of the findings that we had, and going to the recommendations, it was just more so to be there for the mental health and the well-being of our teachers of color, and to really uplift that, because we're also bringing with us a lot of past histories, a lot of past traumas, like what Corey alluded to,
and acknowledging it. So I think if had it been acknowledged, when people acknowledge and see, then they can act upon it. It's been invisible too long.
Yeah. So just real quick to add a bit more context, right? Dr. Bettina Love her recent book kind of highlights some of the historical trajectories. And I think since Brown versus Board of Education, which was a moment in time where, the reconciliation that I think our nation sought to do around some of his racial oppression was to bring together our communities. But I think it actually had an adverse effect. Folks of color, because we were legally and physically segregated, we were the ones that took care of our communities. But after Brown versus Board of Education, the certification of the folks that were teaching our kids, that was taken away from us. And then that was placed in the hands of folks who had access to that. And historically, that's been white folks, right? And over the years, I think we've seen that. The trauma and the unresolved implementation of desegregation and what that has done. And that's also contributed to the state that we're in right now. And being able to recognize, again, our history has implications in our lived experience in our future. And that's one of the reasons why we came together to really highlight this work. Yeah. We found some very simple, tangible things.
And also, I think just piggybacking on that, Corey, too, when we talk about that historical context, one of our findings was to find funds for teachers of color, to whether that be scholarship, whether that be paying them for that additional labor. And we know that historically, people of color have been underpaid and don't have the generational wealth that others have had privilege to have. And so some of that is to find necessary funds in order to ensure that teachers have a living wage, because we're supporting a lot. And I don't want to use that as a blanketed statement, but teachers of color often are conduits for their families financially. And so really not being able to just have my salary be my salary. Yeah. And so that's part of what we sought to make sure was understood in the report.
I'd love to have an offline conversation with you about the board, Brown versus the Board of Education. Again, that might be another IPA talk, because I've been challenged with my thinking related to that, or what I was maybe taught in school when I was, for absolutely. Sure. Very different perspective on that.
If we think about it, that's where the teacher shortage happened, because we eradicated a whole group of teachers. The workforce.
Well, and the idea of just moving kids around, thinking that was going to cure that was the wrong thing to be doing. But that is definitely another IPA talk. So let me come back, Corey, real quick, and I at the risk of going down a rabbit trail that there's no way we can get all the way to in this IPA talk. But
we can come back.
Well, we may need to, because I just want to offer up transparently for myself. I am an individual that grew up an hour west of Springfield. Mm-hmm. In a white rural community, and had maybe one or two African American students in my whole high school of 100 students. There was K-12, one building, 400 kids, where I went to school, and I wouldn't trade that experience for anything. But I do know that there was much about the world that I didn't know and needed to understand. And so, what I appreciate about these conversations and research like this and the recommendations that are coming out, it's helping and requiring for me to be reflective for myself and thinking about those things for myself personally, for my own kids. I have 5. That's not bragging. That's a prayer request. But how do I make sure that they recognize these issues and how it's important they carry themselves moving forward. But more importantly for us as an organization, IPA, we know that we have to, as school leaders, have to take some responsibility here. And as an organization supporting school leaders, have to take responsibility. And while these are just the beginning stages, it's not by any means the end. We're adding a diversity and equity chair to our board. We've just done that, and we're going to start having these conversations, and they're not always going to be easy, including for myself, because of my comfort. overcoming human nature and behavior is hard because we have our own personal inertia to get over. And that's not an excuse for not doing anything. It's just what we have to help overcome.
And when we start going through those different transformational mind shifts, we engage differently. We're considering things differently. We're less likely to make those microaggressions. We're more conscious of those things.
And our hiring becomes different. So our hiring practices. So when we talk about like this idea that there are not a lot of Black and brown teachers coming into the profession, but really the statistic tells us that more students of color are going into the profession now, but they're not getting hired at the rate of their white peers. So what is catching them in the system? And so having that, reframing the question to say, what does culture and diversity look like here? And how does it benefit my students? Even in rural Illinois, and like having conversations that are uncomfortable, like you said, but that make room for teachers of color when they arrive, and also being creative and strategic about finding them. Right. So not, while we don't have teachers of color, how can I be creative and strategic about bringing teachers of color into my space? And when they do come in, am I seeing them as the professionals that they are compared to their white counterparts? So I think hiring practices have to change, and implicit bias and anti-racist practices need to start in HR.
Yeah, and I think that there's a huge opportunity here because a lot of college campuses and a lot of workplaces are already engaging in like diversity, equity, and inclusion talks. So it's almost becoming normal. And if it's not becoming normal, people are feeling pressured to have these conversations. So I do think there's a huge opportunity for current principals to be making hiring personal. Like when you make hiring personal, you're able to engage in these conversations and then draw young people into your space.
So let me drill down on what you mean by making hiring personal. So what does that mean to you?
I think it goes back to Keisha's point of like, if you're able to acknowledge your privilege and your intentionality for your students, you're going to automatically draw that vulnerability in from a teacher where they're going to want to give you that extra hour or two after school, right? Because you just made your student's story a part of their story. So like we want you to contribute to our environment, to our community, because I care as a white male or as a white female that everybody's story is heard. So that's why you matter.
And when you matter, then I can see that others matter too. So when that person comes in for the interview, I don't say, oh, they didn't use the right conjugation of that verb and see that as a reason to exclude them from the hiring practices. I can say, oh, that person reminds me of this person, or I know this, and don't use it as exclusion, but humanize.
I'm grateful for your time. I'm looking forward to you continuing to engage with our organization around this conversation. We've talked, I know, Keisha and Corey, you may have been a part of some of those emails as well, where we've talked about having you be a part of our school leader networks, maybe coming and speaking to our boards. So we're excited about that as well. And make sure Violetta. Okay, I want to make sure that I have that
I
right.
do Violet in English, Violetta, if I know that you're a Spanish speaker, so maybe I judged you.
No, yeah, I wasn't quite on the mark. Sorry if I didn't meet your expectations for that. I have plenty of room to grow in a lot of areas, trust me, with that.
You acknowledged it.
Oh yeah, well, hey,
That one.
hey man, I told you I have 5 kids at home, so I'm acknowledging things all the time in my house.
No, but we appreciate the opportunity to come and have the conversation.
Yeah.
And we look forward to seeing the action behind it, because this is flat if it doesn't produce like results. So, and we're excited to help in any way. Well, I'm speaking for y'all.
Yeah.
I mean, we are. We can do that. But the time is now.
Yeah,
you know, we are in urgent times. We got to do it.
Yeah.
We have to.
Yeah.
You bet. Well, thanks to the 3 of you for making the long trip from Chicago down to Springfield. We appreciate it. Hang on, I'm going to get us out of here.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
That's okay. I got to close this things up.
Yeah, I was like...
Fun group here, by the way. So again, my name is Jason Leahy with the Illinois Principals Association, Executive Director there. Corey, Violetta. I love that. Keisha, thank you so much. Who are all Teach Plus fellows. I aspire to be a fellow. I'd like to know more what that means at some point in time. But if there's anything the IPA can do for you at any time, don't hesitate to give us a call, or you can check us out on the web. Take care.